say that I am whoring for goring, which means that I do things that I wouldn't, in the ordinary course of my life, have done, had it not been that I needed to make money to keep Castle Goring, first of all, to restore it and then to keep it afloat.
It begins, as so many royal controversies do, with a moment that seems small at first glance but refused to stay contained, because what unfolded in Australia was never just about a tour. It was about a pattern, a perception, and now, a new layer of accusation that threatens to redefine everything that came before. The question now is not whether the tour struggled. The question is whether something far more serious has been added to that narrative, and if so, why now? Because as the fallout from Australia continues to build, a new claim has entered the conversation, one that carries weight far beyond poor attendance or failed optics. Allegations of anti-Semitic conduct, tied to a specific moment, a specific choice, and a specific context, are now circulating in ways that cannot simply be dismissed as routine criticism. And here's the uncomfortable part. What if this wasn't just a misstep, but something that people are interpreting as deliberate? Or even worse, what if the ambiguity itself is the problem? You have to understand the backdrop to see why this is escalating. The Australian tour was already under scrutiny for what many observers described as a blurred line between service and self-promotion. The repeated pattern, charitable visits followed by commercial tie-ins, emotional moments followed by product listings, created a narrative that people could not ignore. And when that narrative starts to form, every new detail is no longer judged in isolation, it is judged as part of a pattern. So when a visual choice, something as seemingly simple as clothing, intersects with a site carrying deep cultural and religious trauma, people do not see coincidence first. They see meaning. And that is where the situation becomes dangerous. Because now the conversation is no longer about whether the tour was successful or not. It has shifted into a question of intent. Was this an oversight? Was it a failure of awareness? Or was it, as some critics are now suggesting, a calculated decision that backfired? And let me ask you something directly. When someone has repeatedly described themselves as detail-oriented, as someone for whom nothing is accidental, do people still believe in accidents? This is where the pressure builds, because those past statements begin to work against you. When you position yourself as meticulous, as someone who controls every visual and every message, you lose the protection of plausible oversight. Every choice becomes intentional in the eyes of the public. And that creates a trap. Because now, even if something truly was unintentional, it doesn't get interpreted that way anymore. It gets filtered through a growing perception that everything is part of a larger strategy. And here's where it gets even more complicated. The same day that this moment occurred, the outfit in question was reportedly linked to commercial activity. And that detail, whether people think it matters or not, has become central to how this entire situation is being judged. Because it reinforces the exact criticism that has followed the tour from the beginning, that moments of significance are being used as platforms for monetization. So now you have three layers stacking on top of each other. A sensitive location with deep cultural meaning, a visual choice that some are interpreting as inappropriate, and a commercial element that makes the entire moment feel transactional. Can you see why this is no longer just a PR issue? This is where the narrative starts to shift from criticism to accusation. And once that shift happens, it becomes incredibly difficult to reverse, because accusations invite investigation, and investigation creates records that cannot simply be managed through messaging. And that brings us to the next critical question. Why is this happening now? Because timing matters. These claims are not emerging in a vacuum. They are arriving at a moment when the broader narrative around the Australia tour is already unstable. Reports of low attendance, dissatisfaction among paid attendees, and visible gaps between expectation and reality have already weakened the perception of success. So when a new controversy enters at this stage, it doesn't feel isolated, it feels like confirmation. Confirmation of a pattern. Confirmation of a criticism. Confirmation, for some, of a deeper issue that has been building for years. But here's something even more important to consider. What happens when multiple controversies begin to overlap? Because now, it's not just about one allegation. It's about the accumulation of issues, commercialization concerns, public reception failures, and now a claim that touches on something far more sensitive and serious. When these layers stack, they don't just add pressure, they multiply it. And at that point, the question changes again. It's no longer, did something go wrong? It becomes, is there a systemic problem in how these appearances are being executed? And that is a much harder question to answer. Because systemic problems cannot be fixed with a single statement or a single clarification. They require a complete reassessment of strategy, messaging, and intent. So now we arrive at a turning point. Will this be addressed directly, or will it be allowed to sit in that dangerous space of ambiguity where interpretation takes over? Because silence, in moments like this, does not neutralize a situation, it often amplifies it. And let me leave you with this thought as we move forward. If the Australian tour was meant to rebuild credibility, to re-establish connection, and to demonstrate relevance, what does it mean when the lasting conversation is not about impact, not about service, but about controversy after controversy? And more importantly, what happens next, when this story is no longer being shaped by controlled narratives, but by the permanent record that continues to grow with every new development? What makes this situation even more volatile is not just the allegation itself, but the way it is colliding with something much bigger, something that has been quietly shaping public perception for a long time, and is now becoming impossible to ignore. Because when people look at what happened in Australia, they are no longer looking at isolated incidents. They are connecting dots. And once an audience starts connecting dots, the narrative shifts from "this happened" to "this keeps happening." And that is a completely different level of scrutiny. Think about it carefully. The tour was presented as a moment of engagement, of connection, of rebuilding a relationship with the public. But what people say they actually witnessed, whether through footage, first-hand accounts, or even simple absence of expected crowds, created a gap between what was promised and what was experienced. And that gap is where trust begins to erode. Now here's the critical part. What happens when that same gap appears again, but this time around something as sensitive as cultural or religious symbolism? Do people give the benefit of the doubt? Or do they assume intention? This is the tension driving the current backlash. Because once trust is weakened, interpretation becomes harsher. Neutral actions begin to look calculated. Ambiguous moments begin to look deliberate. And suddenly, every decision is being analyzed not for what it is, but for what it might represent. And this is where the Australia narrative becomes deeply uncomfortable. The recurring criticism has been that moments of service are being blended with moments of branding. That charitable appearances are not standing alone, but are instead intertwined with visibility strategies, image control, and commercial positioning. Whether that perception is fair or not is almost secondary now, because the perception itself has taken hold. And once that perception exists, every new moment feeds into it. So when people saw what happened at that specific site, they did not view it in isolation. They viewed it through that existing lens. A lens that already suspects calculation, already questions authenticity, and already doubts the separation between intention and outcome. Let me ask you something directly. Can any public figure afford that kind of lens? Because once the audience starts watching you through suspicion instead of trust, even your most neutral actions become controversial. And this is exactly what seems to be unfolding. Now layer onto that the commercial element again, because this is where the narrative becomes even sharper. The idea that items worn during emotionally significant visits are later linked to monetization has become one of the most repeated criticisms of the entire tour. And whether it is technically justified or not, it creates a visual contradiction that is very difficult to defend. You have a moment that should be about reflection, about empathy, about presence. And then you have a parallel narrative about pricing, branding, and promotion. So the audience is left asking, what is the real purpose here? And once that question enters the conversation, it doesn't leave easily. Because now every appearance is being filtered through that same doubt. Is this genuine? Or is this performative? Is this about people? Or is this about positioning? And here's where things become even more complicated. The response from the public in Australia, at least based on what has been widely circulated, does not appear to match the scale of the operation that was prepared. There were expectations of crowds, expectations of enthusiasm, expectations of engagement. But what people saw, empty spaces, quiet receptions, and moments that lacked energy, has created a visual narrative that contradicts the intended one. And visual narratives are powerful, because they don't need explanation. A photograph of an empty barricade tells a story instantly. A silent crowd tells a story instantly. A moment where expected excitement simply isn't there tells a story instantly. So now, combine that visual narrative with the growing list of criticisms, and then add a serious allegation into that mix. What do you think happens next? Because at that point, the story stops being controlled by messaging. It starts being controlled by accumulation. Every new detail doesn't stand alone. It reinforces everything that came before it. And this is where the danger becomes structural. Because now, it's not just about fixing one issue. It's about confronting a narrative that has momentum. And momentum is difficult to stop. Let's take this one step further. If the original goal of this tour was to re-establish credibility and rebuild connection, then the outcome, at least in terms of public conversation, appears to be moving in the opposite direction. Instead of clarity, there is confusion. Instead of connection, there is skepticism. Instead of rebuilding, there is questioning. So the obvious question becomes, why? Why is there such a disconnect between intention and reception? Is it execution? Is it strategy? Or is it something deeper, something about the way the entire approach is being perceived? And here's another question you need to consider. At what point does perception become reality? Because in public life, perception often matters more than intent. You can intend one thing, but if the audience consistently perceives something else, then that perception becomes the dominant narrative. And right now, that narrative is not stable. It is shifting, expanding, and becoming more complex with every new development. Which brings us to a critical turning point. If these allegations continue to circulate, if the broader criticisms continue to grow, and if the visual evidence from the tour continues to be shared, then the story will no longer be about individual moments. It will be about a pattern. And patterns are what define reputations. So here's the real question moving forward. Can this narrative still be redirected? Or has it already reached a point where every new appearance, every new statement, and every new decision will simply be absorbed into the same growing storyline? Because if it's the second option, then what we are witnessing is not just fallout from a tour. It's the formation of a long-term perception that could shape everything that comes next. And as we move into the next phase of this story, there is one thing you should keep asking yourself. When the public stops reacting with emotion and starts reacting with indifference or suspicion, is that the moment where recovery becomes hardest? And yet, just when it seems like the narrative could not become more complex, another layer quietly intensifies the situation, because what we are now witnessing is not just criticism from observers, but the gradual involvement of structures that operate beyond public opinion. And that changes everything. Because public backlash can be managed, debated, even reframed. But once questions begin to enter formal channels, once complaints, reviews, or institutional scrutiny start to take shape, the story moves out of the realm of perception and into the realm of record. And let me ask you something. What happens when a narrative is no longer just discussed, but documented? This is where the Australian chapter becomes particularly significant, because multiple elements from the tour are no longer existing only as online reactions or media commentary. They are being referenced in more formal contexts, in ways that create a trail, one that cannot simply be erased or reinterpreted later. And that trail matters. Because once something becomes part of an institutional record, it gains a different kind of weight. It is no longer just what people are saying. It becomes what has been noted, what has been filed, and potentially, what has been concluded. And here is where the pressure intensifies. Because now the narrative is no longer moving at one speed, it is moving at two. On one side, you have the public conversation, fast-moving, emotional, constantly evolving, driven by clips, images, and reactions. On the other side, you have the slower, quieter process of formal review, where timelines are longer, language is more precise, and outcomes carry consequences that extend far beyond headlines. So let me ask you directly, if both of these processes are unfolding at the same time, which one ultimately defines the truth? Because this is where the stakes rise dramatically. If the public conversation fades, but the institutional record remains, then the long-term impact is shaped not by what trended, but by what was formally established. And that is not something that can be easily controlled. Now, layer this onto the existing situation. You already have a narrative of mixed reception, questions about authenticity, concerns about commercialization, and now an allegation that touches on cultural sensitivity. And into this environment, you introduce the possibility of formal scrutiny. Do you see how the situation shifts from unstable to potentially irreversible? Because once multiple threads begin feeding into formal processes, they do not simply disappear. They accumulate. They build context. They create a framework through which future actions are judged. And that leads to a critical realization. This is no longer just about what happened in Australia. This is about how Australia will be remembered. And more importantly, how it will be referenced moving forward. Because every future appearance, every future project, every future public moment will now carry this context with it. It becomes part of the background, part of the lens through which everything else is viewed. And that is incredibly difficult to undo. But here is where the situation becomes even more intriguing. Because while scrutiny increases, so does silence. And silence, in moments like this, is never neutral. It is interpreted, sometimes as caution, sometimes as strategy, and sometimes as avoidance. So the question becomes, what does silence mean here? Is it a deliberate decision to not amplify the situation? Or is it an indication that there is no clear way to respond without making things worse? Because in high-pressure narratives like this, every response carries risk. Addressing the issue directly can draw more attention to it. Ignoring it can allow it to grow unchecked. And choosing the wrong tone can escalate rather than calm the situation. So what would you do? Would you confront the narrative head-on, knowing it could intensify scrutiny? Or would you step back, hoping it loses momentum over time? And here's the uncomfortable truth. Both strategies have failed in similar situations before, which means there may not be a safe option left. And that brings us to another turning point. Because as this story continues to unfold, it is no longer just about actions. It is about interpretation of actions, and even interpretation of inaction. Every move is being watched. Every decision is being analyzed. And every moment of ambiguity is being filled by speculation. Now consider what happens when this level of scrutiny meets an already divided audience. Because the public is no longer reacting as a single group. There are those who defend, those who criticize, and those who are simply watching to see what happens next. And when an audience is divided like this, narratives do not settle, they compete. One side frames events as misunderstandings or misrepresentations. Another frames them as evidence of a deeper pattern. And the undecided audience. They look at the accumulation and try to decide which interpretation feels more consistent. So let me ask you, what becomes more powerful in that moment? A single explanation, or a consistent pattern? Because if the audience starts to believe in a pattern, then every new event, no matter how small, reinforces that belief. And that is where reputations begin to solidify. Not in one moment, but in repeated interpretation. And this is exactly where the current situation appears to be heading. Because the Australian tour is no longer being discussed as a standalone event. It is being used as a reference point, a case study, a moment that people return to when evaluating everything that follows. And once something becomes a reference point, it doesn't fade, it anchors the narrative. So now the real question emerges. What happens when the next appearance takes place? Because it will not be judged on its own. It will be compared. Compared to Australia. Compared to the criticisms. Compared to the allegations. Compared to the expectations that were not met. And that comparison will determine whether the narrative shifts or deepens. And here's where the tension reaches its peak. If the next chapter repeats even a fraction of these issues, the narrative will not reset, it will escalate. But if it is handled differently, if it breaks the pattern, then there is still a possibility of redirecting the story. So which direction do you think this is heading? Because at this point, we are no longer just watching events unfold. We are watching a narrative either solidify or collapse under its own weight. And as we move into what comes next, keep this in mind. When a story reaches this level of scrutiny, it is no longer controlled by intention. It is controlled by consistency. And right now, Consistency is exactly what the audience is searching for. And just when it feels like the pressure has reached its peak, there is another shift happening beneath the surface. One that is quieter, less visible, but potentially far more decisive than anything we have discussed so far. Because this is no longer only about public reaction or even institutional scrutiny. This is about positioning inside a system that operates on hierarchy, timing, and control. And here's the question you need to ask yourself. When controversy continues to build externally, what happens internally? Because institutions, especially ones as structured and tradition-driven as the monarchy, do not respond emotionally. They respond strategically. They observe, they assess, and most importantly, they wait for the right moment. So what if the real story here is not just what is happening in public, but what is quietly being decided behind closed doors? Now think about the current situation. You have a growing narrative of controversy, a series of public moments that have not landed as intended, and now allegations that elevate the seriousness of the discussion beyond simple criticism. At the same time, there is a noticeable absence of direct intervention from the highest level. And that absence is not accidental. Because timing, in systems like this, is everything. Let me ask you something. Why act immediately when waiting can create clarity? Because every additional development, every new headline, every new layer of public reaction adds more data. It reveals patterns. It shows whether something is temporary, or whether it is becoming a defining trajectory. And right now, it appears that trajectory is still forming. But here's where things become even more interesting. There are already indications, subtle but significant, that internal positions are not aligned. Different approaches, different levels of tolerance, different visions for how situations like this should be handled. And when alignment is missing, action is delayed. So what does that tell you? It tells you that what happens next may not be a simple decision. It may be the result of competing priorities. On one side, there is the desire to maintain stability, to avoid escalation, to prevent the situation from becoming even more public than it already is. On the other side, there is the need to protect long-term credibility, to draw boundaries, and to ensure that certain lines are not repeatedly crossed. And when those two priorities collide, hesitation becomes inevitable. Now let's take this one step further. Because while decisions may be delayed, the environment is not standing still. Public perception is continuing to evolve. Media narratives are continuing to shift. And most importantly, the accumulation we talked about earlier is continuing to grow. So the question becomes, what happens if a decision comes too late? Because timing does not just influence effectiveness, it defines it. Act too early, and you risk acting without full clarity. Act too late, and you risk losing control of the narrative entirely. And right now, it feels like the balance between those two risks is becoming increasingly difficult to manage. But here's another angle you need to consider. What if the current silence is not hesitation, but calculation? Because in high-level strategy, sometimes the most powerful move is not immediate action, but controlled inaction. Allowing events to unfold, allowing narratives to settle, allowing the situation to reach a point where the next step is not just justified, but inevitable. So let me ask you directly, are we watching indecision, or are we watching preparation? Because the answer to that question changes how everything that follows will be interpreted. If it's indecision, then the situation risks drifting, becoming more chaotic, more unpredictable. But if it's preparation, then what comes next could be far more decisive than anything we have seen so far. And that brings us to a critical turning point in this entire story. Because eventually, there will be a moment where something shifts. A statement, a decision, a visible change in approach. Something that signals that the current trajectory cannot continue as it is. And when that moment arrives, it will not just address the present situation. It will redefine the future. Because every action taken at that level sets a precedent. It sends a message not just about one situation, but about how similar situations will be handled moving forward. So the stakes here are not limited to one tour, one controversy, or one set of allegations. They extend much further. They touch on the boundaries between personal branding and institutional identity. They challenge the balance between modern visibility and traditional restraint. And they raise a fundamental question that cannot be ignored. Where is the line? Where is the line between independence and association? Between personal choice and institutional responsibility? Between visibility and vulnerability? And perhaps most importantly, who decides where that line is drawn? Because up until now, it has often felt like that line is being tested rather than defined. Pushed, adjusted, explored in real time rather than clearly established in advance. And when a line is not clearly defined, it creates space for repetition. Repetition of controversy. Repetition of confusion. Repetition of narratives that never fully resolve. So now we arrive at a moment of tension. Because the longer this continues without a clear boundary being established, the more difficult it becomes to establish one later. Expectations shift. Norms adapt. What once would have been considered unacceptable becomes normalized simply because it was not addressed. And that is where the real risk lies. Not just in what has already happened, but in what it allows to happen next. So as we move forward, there is one question that sits at the center of everything. Not just about the individuals involved, not just about the specific allegations, but about the system as a whole. Will there be a line drawn? Or will the absence of a line become the new standard? Because if it's the second option, then what we are witnessing is not just a controversy unfolding. It is a transformation. A shift in how boundaries are understood, how expectations are set, and how accountability is defined. And once that shift happens, it does not easily reverse. So now, as the story continues to build, as the pressure continues to rise, and as the next chapter begins to take shape, keep this in mind. Sometimes the most important part of a story is not what has already happened, but what the system allows to happen next. And now we arrive at the moment that quietly determines everything that comes next, because after the noise, after the headlines, after the speculation and the debate, there's always a point where the story stops expanding outward and starts closing in on consequences. And here's the question you need to ask yourself. When a narrative reaches this level of pressure, does it fade, or does it force a turning point? Because what we have seen so far is not just controversy, it is accumulation. Each layer, from the reception in Australia to the questions around intent, to the more serious allegations now entering the discussion, has built a structure that is no longer easy to dismantle. And when a structure like that forms, it does not simply disappear with time. It demands resolution. But what does resolution even look like in a situation like this? Does it come in the form of a direct response, something clear and undeniable that addresses every concern head-on? Or does it come indirectly, through actions, through changes in approach, through a noticeable shift that signals awareness without ever fully acknowledging the issue? And here's where it becomes even more complex. Because the audience is no longer just watching for what is said. They are watching for what changes. They are watching for consistency. They are watching for signs that the pattern we have been discussing is either being broken or continuing exactly as before. So let me ask you directly, what would convince you that the narrative has changed? Would it be words? Or would it be behavior? Because in situations like this, words can calm a moment, but only behavior can change a perception. And right now, perception is the real battleground. The Australian chapter, whether intended or not, has become a reference point that people will return to again and again. Every future appearance will be measured against it. Every new project will be compared to it. And every decision will be interpreted through the lens it has created. So the next move is not just important. It is defining. Because it will answer a question that has been building throughout this entire story. Was Australia an exception? Or was it an example? And that distinction matters more than anything else. If it was an exception, then what follows will look different. It will feel different. It will break the pattern and begin to rebuild trust step by step. But if it was an example, then what follows will reinforce everything that people are already starting to believe. And once that belief solidifies, it becomes incredibly difficult to change. Now think about the broader implications for a moment. Because this is not just about one tour or one controversy. It is about credibility. It is about consistency. And it is about whether a public identity can sustain itself when the gap between intention and perception continues to widen. And here's something even more important. The audience is evolving. First, there is curiosity. Then there is engagement. then there is debate. But eventually, if the same patterns repeat, something else happens. Indifference. And indifference is far more dangerous than criticism. Because criticism means people still care enough to react. Indifference means they have already made up their mind. So let me ask you, are we watching a narrative that is still being decided, or one that is already settling? Because if it is settling, then the focus is no longer on changing minds. It is on preventing further decline. And that is a much harder position to recover from. But here's where the story takes one final, critical turn. Because while public perception is one side of the equation, legacy is the other. And legacy is not shaped in real time. It is shaped in hindsight. It is built from the accumulation of moments, the patterns that emerge, and the conclusions people draw when they look back and connect everything together. So the question becomes, when people look back at this chapter, what will they see? Will they see a period of missteps that were corrected? Or will they see the moment where a pattern became permanent? And more importantly, who gets to decide that? Because in the end, it is not the headlines, not the statements, not even the immediate reactions that define a story. It is the lasting impression. The one that remains after everything else has moved on. And that impression is being shaped right now, in real time, by every decision, every response, and every moment that either reinforces or challenges the narrative we have followed throughout this entire journey. So as we close this chapter, there is one final question I want you to carry with you. When a public figure reaches a point where every action is interpreted through suspicion rather than trust, is the real challenge proving innocence? Or rebuilding belief? Because those are not the same thing. And only one of them truly changes the future. If you've stayed with this story until now, you already understand that this is not just about a single event or a single allegation. It is about how narratives are built, how they evolve, and how they ultimately define reputations over time. So tell me what you think. Do you believe this situation can still be redirected, or has it already crossed the point where perception becomes permanent? Drop your thoughts below, because your perspective is part of this conversation. And if you want more deep breakdowns like this, where we go beyond headlines and look at what's really happening beneath the surface, make sure you subscribe and stay connected, because the next chapter of this story is already beginning.